This is our Pariser Platz seminar, which we organize in Berlin on site, and sometimes, like today, we do it online. Ladies and gentlemen, today our eyes are Ukraine. Even if we do not deal with the history of this country on the regular basis, we suddenly learn its cartography. We know where Poltava, Odessa, Lviv, Chernihiv, Kyiv, Donetsk, or Kharkiv are. History is not over, it's happening before our eyes. And the region that used to be on the sidelines, so to say, is now becoming the center of our attention. Currently, at our institute in Berlin, there is an aid center for Ukraine, which is organized by the grassroots level self-organizing networks of the Ukrainian diaspora in Berlin. However, the topic of today's lecture was agreed with Professor Serhii Plokhii before Russia's full-scale invasion against Ukraine. Since we opened at the Institute, since we opened the exhibition about Rafael Lemkin and the concept of genocide at the beginning of February, I wanted one of the accompanying events to be about the Holodomor. Thank you very much to Serhii for agreeing to talk on this subject. The title of his talk is The Geography of Famine, Putting the Holodomor on the Map. In this talk, Serhii Plokhii, professor of history at the University of Harvard, will discuss the finding of the scholars working on the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute project MAPA, Digital Atlas of Ukraine. By using the GIS-based mapping of the demographic and other data on the history of the famine, the members of the project uncovered a peculiar feature of the Ukrainian famine that sets it apart from the famine and starvation in other parts of the Soviet Union. Professor Serhii Plokhii is the Mikhailo Khrushchevsky Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard University, and he serves as director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. He is author of many books and papers on history of Ukraine, of Russia, on Ukrainian nation, on Cossacks and the Soviet Union. Among his publications are, for example, The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine, The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union, and The Cossack Myth, History and Nationhood in the Age of Empires. Dear Serhii, once again, thank you for agreeing to be with us, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Plokhii, for this introduction. Thank you a lot for initiating this lecture and certainly adding the theme of Holodomor, the Great Ukrainian Famine of 1932-1933 to the program of the associated with the exhibition that was just opened, dedicated to Rafael Lemkin. It's my pleasure to address this topic. It's also my pleasure to present to you the results of the research done by the Harvard University. And I will talk in more detail about that research and its results in the next 40 to 50 minutes. Let me now try to share with you the screen. And the sharing the screen is an important undertaking in this particular case, because I will be talking about spaces, I will be talking about maps, and I will be showing maps, and maps will be an important part of this presentation. But let me start with Rafael Lemkin. the creator of the concept of the genocide, who believed that the Ukrainian famine of 1932-1933, known as Holodomor, certainly belonged to that category. This is an issue that is being discussed today on different levels, academic, political, and otherwise. And it's very important to keep in mind that the person who came up with the concept and with the idea considered the Holodomor to be one of the genocides. Now, that being said, Lemkin thought about the Holodomor not as a genocide in its own right, but as a part of a genocide that was really happening in Ukraine in the early 1930s, exactly at that time, 1932, 1933. Other elements of the genocide, according to Lemkin, were the attack on the Ukrainian cultural institutions, national cadres, including the Communist Party cadres at that time. The institutions would include the Academy of Sciences. There was a people from the Academy of Sciences were put on trial. Religious institutions were part of that as well. So it's an attack on Ukraine, on Ukrainian nation culture institutions and the people, in peasantry in particular. So that the way how the famine of 1932-1933 in Ukraine fit the Lemkin's definition of genocide. What I am going to talk about today will be mostly about the famine, but it will be in close connection to this understanding of genocide by Rafael Lemkin. Lemkin came up with the idea of the genocide and also considered Ukrainian famine to be part of the genocidal phenomenon in the situation and in the conditions where he, of course, had no access to the archival documents. He relied on available publications at the time, and there were a limited number of them. But it is almost really amazing to what degree working with the open and published documents and also with the memoirs and recollections and testimonies of the survivors of the famine, he was able to get to the core of some of the key processes that led to the famine, that accompanied it. And it was much later, already in the 1990s, when the documents came to the fore that proved Lemkin right on a number of accounts. And one of those documents came from December of 1932. Those were 2 decrees that were issued as the result of the meeting of the Politburo of the leading body of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and were signed by Joseph Stalin and Vyacheslav Molotov. And one of those documents is especially telling, because the official title of the document is that it was a resolution on the grain procurement in western parts of the Soviet Union and in Ukraine and in parts of the Russian Federation as well, in particular the Kuban region in southern Russia, which originally was settled mostly by Ukrainians, and in the 1930s, the Ukrainians constituted at least 1/2 of the population of that region, and that was compact settlements, so they were not dispersed. Russians and Ukrainians were not dispersed, but they were Ukrainian settled regions of Kuban and Russian settled regions. So that document dealt mostly with the task of going to the villages in the listed areas in Ukraine and southern Russia and getting grain out of the peasants. But in the same document, there would be a number of resolutions dealing with things that had, at the first glance, had no relation whatsoever to grain procurement. first of all, the officials, the party officials that were listed in that document for failure to fulfill the quotas and that were supposed to put on trial were almost exclusively Ukrainians or coming from Ukraine. Second, there was a decision to resettle the entire settlement, the entire village in the Kuban region settled by Ukrainians, resettle into the central Russia and bring in the veterans of the Red Army to take over that village. Last but not least, there was a number of resolutions dealing with issues of Ukrainian language, culture, and education. So the decision was made to stop publishing in Ukrainian or teaching in Ukrainian in the institutions of higher learning or in the secondary schools that existed at that time outside of Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So in areas like Kuban or in the areas of Far East where the Ukrainians, there were compact settlements of Ukrainians. Within Ukraine itself, there were put limits on the kind of the so-called Ukrainization of policy dealing with Ukrainian language and culture that was conducted at that time. And the assumptions were made that the problems with the grain procurement in Ukraine or in Ukraine settled areas outside of Ukraine were linked directly to the Ukrainian nationalism and also to the activities of the agents and spies sent to Ukraine by the Ukrainian government in exile, in particular in Poland. So Stalin would be writing also in letters to Molotov and to others about the agents of Pilsudski, who was the leader of Poland at that time, and the Petlurites, the followers of Simon Petlura, the leader of the Ukrainian government, one of the governments during the revolution. So there was just one document that put together grain procurement, fight against nationalism, liquidation of the Ukrainian educational system outside of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. By the way, all those Ukrainians were registered from now on as Russians. So things that Lemkin in the 40s and 50s were writing about in terms of this interconnection of the nationality policy and grain procurement policy that creates famine and kills millions of people. There was just one single document right there in front of us, which was saying that Lemkin was right. Now, big part of the debate about Ukrainian famine in general and the question about whether it was genocide or not is linked to the question about whether it was a man-made famine or not. And I will address that later, but it's the issue where there is basically a consensus today. The absolute majority of scholars don't question the issue of the famine of 1932-1933 was man-made famine. Now, another question which has more variety of opinions is the question of whether famine was just a Ukrainian phenomenon, whether Ukrainians or Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was specifically targeted or not, or it was all-union phenomenon, and actually there was nothing specific Ukrainian about that, and in that sense, there was nothing to support really Lemkin's definition of famine and other political and cultural acts associated with it as an act of genocide. A few years ago, and maybe some of you had a chance to see that film, very good film in my opinion, in terms of how it was made, film by Agnieszka Holland, which was called Mr. Jones. It's based on the real story of the English reporter Gareth Jones, not English, British reporter Gareth Jones. his story, how he got to Moscow and then to Ukraine and became one of the witnesses of the famine. Then the most important part of the story is that he was writing about that. He was talking about that. And for that, he got under attack from a well-established another British reporter whose name was Walter Duranty, who before that got a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the social transformation of the Soviet Union and agriculture in particular. And really Gareth Jones was ostracized attacked and ostracized for telling the truth. One of the arguments that was used by Walter Duranty against Gareth Jones and his reporting on famine in Ukraine was that, well, first of all, there was this play with words. There was no famine, there was starvation. So that was one quote unquote argument used against Gareth Jones. But another was that, well, what he saw was maybe true for particular areas in the Soviet Union, but that was not true for the entire Soviet Union. So what Gareth Jones allegedly did, he took some local story and turned it into a big one, or if not global one, in terms of the starvation and famine happening in the Soviet Union in general. Well, that argument was very interesting in a sense that it was based at least partially on truth, because what Gareth Jones really documented as he was going through the Ukrainian border from Russia into Ukraine, he documented a huge difference that existed between the level of the famine, or indeed starvation, in the Russian part of the Soviet Union, in southern Russia, and all-out famine in Ukraine, in particular in Kharkiv region, the city that is today under siege, being shelled, where a war crime is being committed now by Russia and Russian army. So Gareth Jones got to Kharkiv, at that time capital of Ukraine, and he documented the famine that was happening there, that taking place there. Documented exactly something that would certainly be a foundation for Rafael Lemkin's thinking about differences between the level of starvation, between the starvation in the Russian Federation, at least in that part of Russian Federation, and Ukraine. Here I'm already going to show you the results of research that was done by the scholars at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. It was a collective effort. We at the Institute relied on the demographic data that was provided to us by a group of American and Ukrainian demographers. We were trying to then map that data that we got using the GIS-based principles of mapping. And I will try now to show you, I hope it will work. I will try to bring you to the different place. This is the map, the Great Famine in Ukraine interactive map that you can find on the website of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, where we created numerous layers of information, which you could, first of all, use, and second of all, you can ask your own research questions. And you can, let's say, take together the data on the number of people, where they were dying and how they were dying, and compare that to the level of collectivization. or look, for example, at the ethnic composition of Ukraine at that time, and see what ethnic groups were in particularly hit the hardest by the famine. What you see here, given that our lecture is taking place at least virtually in Berlin, I brought up to the screen the map of the German settlements in Ukraine according to the 1926 censuses. And you can then look also at other groups. You can look at Bulgarians, for example. Here would be this Bulgarian settlement. You can look at the population losses, let's say total direct famine losses, 1932-1934. They can be represented in different ways so that you could compare the information that comes from different sources and different layers. For example, let me see here. We can go back to the ethnic composition and bring up the percentage of Belarusian settlements by rayon, by each individual unit or county as percentage of the population. And this is just to show you what these maps can do, in a sense that they present the data that we collected. It also presents the analysis that we did. But it also gives you an opportunity to ask your own research questions and conduct your own research. And again, this is the URL, but you can just go and Google MAPA Digital Atlas of Ukraine, MAPA, M-A-P-A, or MAPA HURI, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and it will bring it to our website. Famine of 1932-1933, the Holodomor, is one of the largest modules that we have there, but we have others on war in Ukraine, on displaced population, on the early history of Podolia, on the marital ties of the Kievan princes during Middle Ages, and so on and so forth. So we have a number of modules. I'm presenting here results of just one of them. And the maps that I'm going to show to you, they come from this interactive map. And so I really encourage you to go and check for yourself and spend some time on that with that resource, especially if anything that I am saying and I'm going to say, you would have, let's say, doubts. Or you would have to check that and double check that for yourself. Or you want to learn more, because again, the time is certainly limited of my presentation and then the discussion that will follow. So please treat this as an invitation to go and do some research on your own. Now let me return to the static maps. Again, they're based on those maps that I just showed to you. So here is the map of the famine as it was taking place in the eastern part of the Soviet Union between 1932 and 1933. What you can see here is the data is based on the sources that come from the Central Archives in Moscow. And what you can see here is that this is the territory of Ukraine. And if you look at the areas that were most affected in the Soviet Union, you will see that there would be this part of Ukraine, then the Kuban region in the Russian Federation, and Lower Volga region, including the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. In terms of the percentage of the death per 100,000 of the population in ethnic terms, The group that was hit the most has been Germans, something that you probably never heard about, and few people write about that. So this is one of the outcomes of our research. So the reason why it's not out there, maybe we ourselves are not talking enough about that, we're not writing about that. And another group in terms of the percentage per population are Ukrainians. This is much better known. The big question why the minorities in the Soviet Union ended up to be hit the most, the worst is again, certainly the hypothesis, and I will be presenting to you with regard of the Ukrainians. There has to be more research to be done in the Germans. Now, what is in common between the Low Volga region and the Kuban region is that these were the areas that were the main grain producing areas in the Russian Federation. So that's where the government representatives went to collect grain. And that's where people died the most. When you look at Ukraine, the areas that were affected the most were not the south, and I'll show you later that were the most main grain producing areas of Ukraine and of the Soviet Union, but the areas that were not considered to be grain producing areas in central Ukraine, in Kyiv and Kharkiv. And this is the first question, this is the first puzzle that we were trying to resolve with the help of, again, data that we have and with the help of our GIS-based mapping. Now I'm zooming on Ukraine. And as you can see here, these are the areas that you just saw that were hit the most by the famine. The numbers are, again, excess death per 1,000. So that means that in the Kyiv Oblast, that was a big Kyiv Oblast, 184 people died for each 1,000. It's more than decimation, right? And Kharkiv is a little bit less, but in the same category. So the eastern part, the Stalin Oblast, Donetsk Oblast, and today's Luhansk, the death rate was lower, 41. Chernihiv was lower, and then somewhere in the middle, the southern main grain producing areas in Ukraine. So we got a closer look at this map. We got the numbers. Now, what does this mean? Why is this happening? So we were trying to zoom on what was happening in those areas and got data, which we didn't get right away. It was difficult to get it, to process it, and so on and so forth, on the level of rayons or counties, not big oblasts. And there were more than 400 counties at that time in Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which it's a strange map of Ukraine. If you are familiar with today's map, and again, as we just discussed, people are now more familiar with Ukrainian map. So Western Ukraine, which was at that time part either of Poland or of Romania or Czechoslovakia, are not included in that map. And they're not included not only because they didn't belong to the Soviet Union, but because there was no famine whatsoever. So in Ukraine, famine was only within the borders of the Soviet Union, but not outside, whether that was Poland, whether that was Czechoslovakia, or whether that was Romania. Now, what we see here is that within the oblasts, the Kyiv and Kharkiv oblast, the impact of the famine, the footprint of the famine was not the same. So these regions of Kyiv Oblast suffered less than areas to the south, and the same. Again, there are some differences also with the Kharkiv Oblast. So what that suggests is that the assumptions made by some scholars of Holodomor that the differences in the population losses depended on very much on how zealous were the regional officials in the collecting of the grain and fulfilling the orders coming from the top, that hypothesis at least doesn't work in this particular case. Again, based on my own research, I can say that it mattered who was the leader of a particular region, but I would say that was a secondary factor, and certainly that more detailed map supports that supposition. Okay, so we now found the area that was most affected, which again doesn't coincide necessarily with the borders of the big regions. Let's move on. What does that mean? What conclusions we can make on this basis? Again, there I put these two maps together so that you could see this is the Kyiv Oblast more clearly, and that's where the areas were affected. So it's roughly here. That's the toll of the Holodomor is up to 180 plus people dying for every 1,000 of the population. The question that we asked trying to figure out why we got this very strange picture, and it's up here at the top, was that we went back in history. Famine is not something absolutely unknown or unheard of, either in the Russian Empire before the revolution, or during the revolution, or for Ukraine per se. Famines occur sometimes with more emphasis on the word natural, in the sense that there would be a drought, there would be all sorts of things associated with weather and so on and so forth. The recent literature on the subject of famine says there is no such thing as 100% natural famine. Always politics is involved in terms of distribution of food and aid and so on and so forth. But some famines are more natural than others. Now, what you see at the bottom here is the map of the famine of 1921 during the time of the revolution and the civil war in the Russian Empire and the attempts of creating of Ukrainian statehood in Ukraine. And as you see, the famine hit southern parts of Ukraine, so its footprint is very different from the footprint of the famine of 1932-1933. I can add to that without showing you maps, but please believe me, without that kind of proof, is that all the previous famines, and there were a number of them in the 19th century that were taking place in Ukraine, they were taking place in these areas in the south, including this famine of the revolutionary youth. So this footprint of the famine is absolutely unprecedented and unique for Ukraine, which suggests also that, well, we deal here with the degree of the man-made famine on a much larger scale than in any other previous famines. So the famine of 1932-1933, in terms of its footprint, is not really, can't be explained by changes in the weather, by cold spring, by drought and other things, it just happens in a different place. And that means it happens for different reasons. What were those reasons? We looked at the map of ecological zones of Ukraine. And that's where we thought, okay, finally we got something. We have here a sort of a match. These are the areas. This is not steppe areas, not main producing areas. These are so-called park zones, the forest steppe areas of Ukraine, where most of the famine of 1932, 1933 happened, where the impact of that famine was the biggest, the largest. And what you see here, I don't know whether you can see it or not, but this is the, trying to open it for myself now. This is the wheat growing areas of Ukraine. The darker the color, the more grain is being produced here. So that's what I was telling you before, but now I can demonstrate that with the map. The areas, the forest steppe areas actually are much less productive. And that's again, on the one hand, confirms what I already told you in a sense that famine happens, or most of the famine happens in the wrong place, not in the grain producing areas like in Russia. But it also tells you that it happens in the areas of a particular ecological region of Ukraine. So there is something. There is some hope that we are getting somewhere with this mapping and with this trying to understand the puzzle that we faced at the very beginning. Now, what we realized when we compared the map of the ecological zones of Ukraine and main grain producing areas, which are here, with the map of collectivization of the agriculture, we ecology and differences in the productivity, grain productivity was not, we were not the first ones who discovered that. Certainly the Soviet planners, the Soviet economic planners were there ahead of us. And it was for that reason that they pushed first and foremost for the collectivization. This is the level of collectivization in Ukraine in 1932, 1933. They pushed for the collectivization first and foremost in the southern parts of Ukraine, where the grain where they could get most of the grain, and of course, collectivization was the way to get to that peasant's grain, to take it out of the village. When this oblasts, that regions that suffered the most, were less collectivized. So what does this mean? Does this mean that the Soviet system actually worked in a sense that where there was more collective farms, the peasants had more chance to survive? Does this mean that in the areas where the peasants were less collectivized, they were more vulnerable to the famine? Again, a question that certainly we tried to answer, and I will show you how we dealt with that issue. So that is the map that helps you maybe understand a little bit better, or at least illustrates what exactly I'm talking about, because this is the number of excess deaths. It's highest in this oblast in the center. It's medium in the south, and it's lowest in the north. So what that says is that collectivization really can't explain the phenomenon of the central Ukraine being hit the most. Because if the question was lower collectivization, or the more collectivization, the less losses from the Holodomor, probably the areas in the north where the collectivization was the lowest, that's where would be the highest numbers of people who died. But it didn't happen that way. So the hypothesis that we just had, that collectivization was good for people surviving, at least doesn't work as a solution for all regions of Ukraine. What we did then, we tried to go beyond the year 1933 and map the famine that started already in Ukraine in the previous year, in the year 1932. And this is the map of the famine of 1932, which, as you can see, apart from the Moldovan Autonomous Republic here, hit in the most profound way the same two big oblasts that were then hit in 1933. And this map shows how much grain and potatoes the peasants were able to stock in the 1930s. And you can see that most of these stocks were in the south. That means that if the famine hits, people can survive there longer, and there were much fewer of those in the middle. Now, where does this unknown famine of 1931-32 really comes from? It comes, and we know that from the letters that were sent by the head of the Ukrainian government at that time, Vlas Chubar, to Moscow, to Joseph Stalin, where he was asking for assistance in 1932, in the summer of 1932, saying that there is a major famine happening in the Kharkiv and Kyiv oblasts. And the reason for that famine was that in 1931, in the fall of 1931, those areas were not being able to fulfill the quotas for grain production that were given to Ukraine as a whole by the center. And to fulfill the quotas in kind, the authorities went there and started to collect non-grain products, including beets and so on. And those were, in particular, the Kyiv Oblast was one of the main beet producing areas in Ukraine. So the famine there started already in 1932 because of the actions of the government. And of course, Chubar got no understanding. Chubar got no support at that time from Stalin, but exactly at that time, in the summer of 1932, Stalin starts to write those letters that I was referring to earlier, to Molotov, to Kaganovich, and to others, saying that we are losing Ukraine. The agents of Pilsudski, the leader of Poland, the agents or the followers of Petlura, they're trying to undermine us. And the party officials in Ukraine, on the local levels, they're not real communists. They're infiltrated by those nationalist and Polish agents. And we have to do something about Ukraine. We have to change the leadership. We have to strengthen the leadership of the secret police there. This is exactly what is happening. That is exactly what is done in the fall of 1932 and then early in 1931 as the reaction already to the famine of 1931, 1932. What we see is that the losses of 1933, which are documented here on this map, really happen in the very same areas where the famine of 1931, 1932 happened. Peasants were already weak. peasants were not able to do sowing, and despite of all of that, the pressure on them continued, because from the point of view of Moscow, they treated Ukraine as a whole, whether those were grain-producing areas or not grain-producing areas. And because they treated Ukraine as a whole, because they treated Ukraine as a hotbed of Ukrainian nationalism, the place where was allegedly full of the Polish agents, because Stalin was concerned about losing Ukraine, whatever was coming from Ukraine, appeals for help, for assistance, were basically ignored or treated as an act of sabotage. So if these areas were not part of Ukraine, they would be never treated with the same harshness. They would never be asked for the same grain, or not the same grain procurement quotas would be actually pushed on them. The focus would be on the south, on the grain producing areas of Ukraine, the same way how it was in Kuban region and in the Low Volga region of Russia. But the policies were designed for Ukraine as a whole, the procurement quotas were created for Ukraine as a whole, and that was the part of this broader policy toward Ukraine, an all-out attack on Ukrainian leadership, on Ukrainian culture that Lemkin was talking about. One more map and one additional argument in favor, or one additional maybe evidence in the favor of the argument that I just presented and now will try to develop. What you see here is the grain that was released to the collective farms mostly, but to other peasants as well, in the spring of 1933, when the mass famine started in late summer of, in the late winter of 1933 and early spring of 1933. The government realized that with people dying in hundreds of thousands and then later in millions, they will lose or will have no harvest for the next year, for the year 1934. So they had to do something to not destroy completely the agricultural base for where they were getting grain, for the purposes of industrialization, for sale grain abroad, and so on and so forth. So they start providing something that is called in historiography as assistance to the regions that were hit the most by the famine. That assistance was really given in the form of the loans that the peasants, if they survive, were supposed to return, to pay back to the government. And that's where the supplies, and they were all controlled by Moscow, that's where they went. They went to the south. They went to the main grain producing areas of Ukraine, because that's where the government wanted actually to keep people still living, still going. It needed those people to produce the next harvest. When the areas that were hit the most were actually, if not completely ignored, then certainly neglected. Those areas where there was famine already going for the second year, the so-called assistance was actually limited there. And they suffered the most. So again, another explanation now given through the policies of the government, not just in terms of the grain procurement, but also in the way how they approached the famine once it was already underway. And at the same time, the government was collecting additional grain from the starving villages in Ukraine, trying to produce enough grain for the sowing campaign of the spring of the next year. And what you see here is actually the grain stocks and the fulfillment of the quotas for collecting of the new grain. And as you can see, of course, the quotas were not much different in terms of the fulfillment from the south, but the stocks, what peasants had in their households, and what they had in the south and what they had in central Ukraine was significantly different. This is the map that shows the death toll in the agricultural areas of Ukraine, and this is in the towns and big cities. There is overlap, but there is also a difference. The main victims of the famine were, of course, in the villages. They were the peasants. This is a map that, to a degree, summarizes our findings, and you can see here the total excess death per 1,000, and they're given again on the oblast level, again highlighting the really the severity of the famine in the central parts of Ukraine. Before I conclude, let me comment also on the regions like Chernihiv and Stalin, or the Donbas region. What is happening there, and why the level of the death is lower than in other parts of Ukraine. The reasons differ between the Donbas, eastern Ukraine, and northern Ukraine, or Chernihiv. What you happen in Donbas is that's where the grain goes, to the mines, to support workers, to support the industrialization effort. And that's where peasants from the countryside, actually they save themselves to go to these construction sites of socialism. In the Dnipropetrovsk area, that was a story of my family. I'm here now talking about that, presenting these results and the life in general, only because my ancestors left the village and went to the Dnipro construction site, made the industrial center of Zaporizhia that was under construction at that time. In the north, that's mostly forested areas of Ukraine. That's where people survived on whatever the forest could produce in terms of, certainly there were animals, there were also berries, there were mushrooms and others, and the level of death was there lower. What we also noticed, although it is not reflected in this map, is that the death level was lower on the border with Poland in particular. And the reason of that is twofold. First of all, there was some smuggling of grain across the border. And the second reason was that in the previous few years, at the time of collectivization, numerous villages and centers in Ukraine went into uprising, went into revolt against the authorities. Entire villages were trying to cross the border into Poland and Romania. And after this uprisings of 1930, the government introduced the policies where the burden of taxation and grain procurement on the border regions was actually lower than on the areas further away from the border, closer to the center. And so again, one more indication that we are dealing here. There's a man-made famine, but also the main argument of this presentation, and I hope that I was able to kind of deliver it in the way that is clear and precise and was able to support it, is the evidence is that the Ukrainian famine doesn't happen in the same way and in the same places as the famine outside of Ukraine. And the only explanation for that is a particular policies of the center that treats the entire Ukraine as one unit in terms of the procurement, in terms of the demands for grain, looks at the entire republic, at its cadres, institutions, language as a threat, looks with suspicion, and introduces policies that would address not only grain procurement, but also politics and culture at the same time. And that certainly puts the Ukrainian famine aside. Apart from the fact that the majority of the people who died in the Soviet Union in 1932, 1933, as the result of the famine, they died in Ukraine. The estimates differ. The estimates that we work with, the group of demographers that we really trust, is 3.9, a little bit more than 3.9 people who died in 1932, 1933, and approximately over 500,000 babies that otherwise would have to be born were not born, so the ultimate number goes to roughly 4.5 million, but direct death is 3.9, between 3.9 and 4 million. But apart from those numbers, again, the geography of the famine, the politics of the famine also put it aside and really confirm the hypothesis. It confirms the beliefs that Rafael Lemkin developed and advanced long before all this information became available to us. So I'm thank you, all of you, very much for your attention. And I see that I exceeded the time given to me, but I hope we still have time for question and answer and for the discussion. Thank you.
Many thanks, Serhii, so for this really interesting talk. I want to encourage all the audience to ask the questions. So if you want to ask the question, please signalize it through chat or question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. And so there are two options to ask the question. So one option is just to write the question you want to ask in the chat, or the second option is to signalize just writing question, and my colleague will enable you to ask the question by yourself. So I would like to ask maybe the first question I have in my head after listening to your talk. So one question would be about the very database. So do you think how complete is so first of all, many thanks for this encouraging us to use this database for other research projects. I think so it would be very interesting to get to know what differences you had collecting data, and how complete is it? So I mean, what kind of archives you use, or you mentioned that there's the data on census of 1926, for example, or but certainly there are many other kinds of data you collected during this project. So what about this completeness and the shape of this database? Could you please?
Thank you for this question. The data is very incomplete. So we know for sure, and there is agreement, it seems to me, on all levels, that there was a huge underreporting of the death in general at that time, and death from famine. So either the causes were given of different kind, or the information was not collected, and there was a cover up later. So again, we have archival evidence of that the documentation was was basically removed and destroyed already in the 1930s. So the data that we have is all the data. That's why we need demographers. They're all calculations. So we have our maps based on the reporting, but there is also the idea that there is huge underreporting. So what the demographers do, they take the censuses that were conducted in 1926 and 1937, 1939. They look at the other statistics about the population migration, out migration, and so on and so forth, and they come with the numbers. And that's why there is this why in Ukraine in particular, there is a big debate whether there is 10 million or more than 10 million people, or there is, as our demographers, our demographic team suggests, it's 3.9 million. The reason for that is that this is calculations. Now, what we are basically quite sure is that we have the best data on the scope of the disaster in terms of its geographic spread. If the formulas, let's say, change tomorrow and we will end up with a different number than 3.9, at least the map, the visual presentation of what happened will not change. At least this is my understanding of what is happening. But the bottom line is that we work with the best what we have at this point and with the best calculations that we have, but they are estimates. And there are different takes on that.
Okay, so in the meantime, we have two first questions in question and answers. So you can read these two questions.
Okay, sure. So if Germans in this case were most hit by the famine, then why special status for Ukrainians as Holodomor is specific massacre against them? So in terms of the study on Holodomor, on genocide in the Soviet Union in general, I am really very much under the influence of the work done by Norman Naimark. And the title of that work is Stalin's Genocides. So basically, if we do research on the Germans and we'll figure out that they died more than the Russian peasants around them, specifically because of the policies that singled out the Germans, I basically have no problem whatsoever talking about a specific German genocide or German population genocide in Lower Volga. The problem is that research has not been done, as I mentioned at the beginning. So what we know is, again, about the famine more than in any other part of the Soviet Union. We know about it in Ukraine because so much research has been done. And we see here, both on the archival level, as I mentioned to you earlier, and on the level of that kind of research, that the policies on nationality, language, culture, and policies on the famine were linked and interconnected, discussed and decided in the same place by the same people, put in writing in the same documents, and then we see the result of that policies when we look at the map and try to analyze the map. So, but it's not an attempt to claim an exclusive status of just for Ukrainian famine as a genocide, a part of it. What I want to really emphasize, and this is probably the second or third time now, is that we need research on that, what happened in the German Autonomous Republic. We need that research, we need research archival, we need to understand what happened there. We have very little, or at least I don't know about much explanation of what happened there. If maybe there are some publications, please let me know about them. Okay, hello from north of Dallas. Okay, hello. What about primary sources for expanding the database? Are there any treasure troves out there from this event? Any personal accounts or diaries? Pre-COVID, my daughter and I saw a small local Holodomor exhibit at the Dallas Public Library using materials from the survivors' families. So maybe crowdsourcing will eventually turn up more evidence of the widening impact this horrific event has had for the generations. Well, thank you very much for this question. That kind of effort has been undergoing in Ukraine for quite a while. And we tried to take it into account and try to take in a good way advantage of what is being there. Again, our focus is mostly mapping. But what we have, if you will go on our website, you will have also photographs that we collect. We tried to put them on the map. It didn't work because they come from a number of very specific localities, and really for the spatial analysis, you need really all regions to be represented, but they're there, they're not put on the map. What we have and we put on the map, and you can click on that and you can listen to the testimonies of the people who survived the famine. These are the testimonies that were collected back in the 1990s, where a lot of people, survivors, were still with us. As time passes by, of course, fewer and fewer. So now when people go and collect the testimonies, very often that would be of their grandparents, what they heard from their parents, and so on and so forth. So we have this survivors per se. So again, but that's what you are suggesting certainly is the way to go in terms of go to the people, collecting artifacts, collecting diaries. Introduction to our module on the famine, which I have authored and then published. It starts with the citing of one of the diaries, and there are numerous diaries of that kind coming from Ukraine. That one was written by a teacher in the Kharkiv region of Ukraine, who writes that while there are people dying around her, and then records rumor in her village saying that, well, the situation is even worse in the south. And that's where normally famine happened. And that's what people believed, that if it's so bad here, it should be even worse in the south. And I start my discussion of the map with that question, whether first of all, where that belief comes from, and whether it was true or not. But again, those sources exist, and I really hope that we didn't exhaust, that there are still really, there are other sources that we didn't have access to yet. Are there any English books looking at what happened to Ukrainians who, okay, somehow it jumped, sorry. Happened to Ukrainians who migrated? I'm thinking of The Worms of Other Sons by Isabel Wilkerson, about the Black migration to the North during World War II to work in war industries. Yes, excellent question. I don't know whether such books exist. I will have to, again, I will be on the lookout. I had at some point an idea, it never materialized, maybe to write a family memoir about famine and migration, because that's part of my personal story, the story of how my grandparents survived. One branch of the family migrated all the way to Kamchatka in Russia to survive. But at this point, I don't think, certainly my family memoir is not written, and I really didn't encounter that kind of books But this is something that certainly should be looked at and researched. It's a great idea. Thank you. Next question. Pedro Souza. In follow-up question, then, could we also classify the Kazakh famine of 1931-33 as similar form of genocide of Holodomor? My question goes on line that very distinct from Soviet policy accident that naturally are never accidents and truly specific genocide, as people being targeted for sake of being targeted at specific people. So in this regard, could we classify most of Soviet deportations and killings of USSR as specific genocides when they were targeting ethnicities or even classes? Again, I would direct you toward work done by Norman Naimark. And again, I don't recall at this point whether he looks at the Kazakhstan famine as a genocide or not. But from my own experience looking at Ukraine, the deportation of the Crimean Tatars very often is referred to as genocide. You know that there are numerous definitions of genocides. Again, that's why or partially at least, that's why I spent so much time at the beginning talking about the understanding of the genocide that Rafael Lemkin proposed to us. There are different types, of course, different disciplines used different genocides. But I certainly encourage the scholars either of what is happening is the German Autonomous Republic or what is happening in Kazakhstan to look at the genocide as a framework, to ask questions, to research, to interrogate their sources. I personally found the genocide framework very useful for my research on the Ukrainian famine, because it provides certain markers. It also provides an opportunity to conduct comparative research. And comparative research, from my perspective, is just one of the most promising and one of the most rewarding ways of examining our sources.
May I ask the question related to this comparative perspective you mentioned?
Sure. Yes, please.
This is exactly what was interesting for me. So you mentioned that there were some other famines in the history, or so to say, the modern ones, and this one you research on. So in Ukraine was in a way different to these others. And could you explain more about this way of comparison you made and the model of famine, which is normal, so to say?
Sure, thanks. Thank you, because really I limited my discussion to different footprints, to the way that it looked differently on the map. And the so-called normal famine is the famine in which there is some form of natural disaster that would be then accompanied by the particular policies of the state that would deny reserves that exist, or have a particular way of the distribution of the produce or grain or whatever it is, that would leave people to their own devices and leave them to die. The potato famine in Ireland certainly was researched from that perspective and from that point of view. And there is also an axiom that that there is no natural famine in its clear way, because it's always about politics and politics of distribution of food. But very few famines really involve the government authorities going there and taking away not just grain, but taking away every kind of food available to the population. And that's what exactly happened in Ukraine and in parts of Russia, including the Kuban and Low Volga in 1932, 1933. Now, in Ukraine, what you also have documented quite well, maybe these things happened in other places as well, I just don't know with that documentation, but after these resolutions which linked politics, culture, and grain procurement from December of 1932, what you see is that the plenipotentiaries of the state, sometimes recruited from the locals, who were getting part of the confiscated food or confiscated grain, they were going to the villages, to the houses, and taking all food away, despite the fact that it couldn't be stored, it couldn't be supplied to the state. The policy was introduced as a form of punishment of the peasants for allegedly hiding grain. So that is the degree of man-made famine that I don't think that any other famine in history, maybe very few famines in history, actually match.
Okay. And could you say what was probably the I don't know, so the most surprising finding you have from this research? I mean, so what is you mentioned that many findings you found interesting. So, for example, this difference between Chernihiv and Donbas Oblast, and on the one hand, and Kyiv and Kharkiv Oblast on the other hand. But was it any other finding which you found really interesting and maybe not so assumed at the start of this research?
Yes, yes. Well, the biggest surprise was the map that we got at the beginning, seeing that most people died in central Ukraine, because I and people that worked with me, we all believed that it would be south. That was the assumption, and then we got something very different, and we were scratching our heads trying to figure out whether something went wrong with the way how we calculated that, with the data that we were working with. And once we checked that and realized that, okay, it looks like we did a decent job, that's what we have, then we started to look in the ways of how to explain that, went to the sources and found the explanation. So which in a different way confirms that our data was correct and the research that we were doing was correct. So that was the biggest surprise. Other than that, it's extremely difficult emotionally type of research to do, especially when you look at the testimonies, when you hear human voices, when you look diaries that people start being believers in the communist experiment, and then recording the death of the members of their family, and then the diary stops because whoever conducted the diary died. And the last sentence is goddamned 5-year plan. So the 5-year plan was associated with collectivization and was associated with famine. And the diary that I'm just talking about was a surprise in its own right, because we got it in southern Ukraine, in Zaporizhia, which is my home region, where a group of my colleagues went to the villages to collect testimonies about famine. And they never imagined at that time that there was this treasure trove of the peasant diaries. The peasants actually, in the villages, had diaries and were writing family histories, and they collected that. So, but they went for the oral testimonies and brought back this treasures. And again, one of our listeners asked about that. So again, that was very pleasant surprise in that sense.
And where are these testimonies to find? And so now, so also in your center, or?
Well, they were published in Zaporizhia when they were found. Again, they asked me to write an introduction for them, so I did that to the peasant diaries in general. They covered also World War I, revolution, and some specifically dealt with famine. But that was just the first stage. Then more diaries started to pop up, some of them in the former KGB archives. So by now it's not such a rarity. Well, it's still very rare, but it's not as much of a rarity. Or back then we didn't know that such things existed.
And what is your strategy, if I may, so to ask this question? So what is your strategy for the book? I mean, how to combine this aggregated data perspective, this level of aggregated data you have from the database, and these testimonies or other sources you found, and of course, so this is always the kind of choice as to how to use it and how to combine it.
Sure. Well, you certainly pointed to a major problem how you bring all of this together, and I personally raise my hands. So neither I nor our group is now working on a book. But what we did, we published a number of articles, and the demographers published their articles and continue to publish them.
Okay.
And in terms of the future of the project, it's the project that develops. One thing that we really wanted to do and then found it impossible to do after the start of the Russo-Ukrainian war, which started 8 years ago in 2014. So our plans were ruined back then. What we wanted to do, we wanted really to go across the border from Ukraine to Russia and collect information and collect sources on what was happening on the other side of the border.
Okay.
To really fully for ourselves to realize the importance of that border between Russia and Ukraine, between Ukraine and Belarus. And that became impossible. So we have this very big general map that I showed to you, big regions of Russia, Ukraine, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, we are not really able at this point to do the micro-analysis that we are doing with the Ukrainian rayons, to go on the other side of the border and to realize, okay, how important the border was. But in general, we know that people there died much less than they died in Ukraine. But it would be good also to look at not just a big chunks of the territory, but look at on the local level. So that's where we wanted to bring our project, but at least at this point, it's not something that we can do.
Yeah. I also found interesting what you said about this personal strategies or adaptation strategies of the people of Ukraine. So, for example, of your family going to the city with industrialization. And I wanted to ask, so about this strategy, this Soviet strategy of industrialization, which had also some victims, I suppose, and how, so do we know anything about the victims of this industrialization? So I mean, but you mentioned that in a way it was the better strategy to go to the city, and there was the better chance to survive in the site of industrialization than in the countryside. But so what is this? Because in a way, this is the question about the point of comparison or the context. Because if we talk about excess deaths, the notion you use, we have the problem probably with first of all, so with this level of normal deaths, so to say. So because there were some other famines before, And then we have also the problems with some other strategies with this variable of policy of the state, because the policy of industrialization probably has also some victims as well as the project of collectivization of the peasantry.
Yes. Well, thank you. These are good questions. I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. I understand that maybe the answers will not be fully satisfactory. But what we have the data on the death in the countryside, in different regions, and in the towns and cities, including industrial cities. So what we found was that the death rate was much higher in the small towns, Jewish shtetls in particular. And the reason for that was that those towns always relied, of course, on the food supply from the village. Now the supply was not coming. The grain that was pumped out of the village was shipped to the industrialization sites like Donbass and Zaporizhia and so on and so forth. And the small towns were left actually on their own. So they were not supplied and they actually lost supply from the village. So from that point of view, the industrial sites were the areas where the chances for survival were the highest from that point of view, but it doesn't mean that people didn't die there. It doesn't mean that people didn't die there, and we have numbers, we have the figures. Again, I can't give you them from the top of my head, but if anyone wants to go on our website, the data is there, the maps are there, the numbers are there, but it was significantly lower level, but people died everywhere, including in the industrial centers.
Yeah. Many thanks. You can choose some issues which were mentioned in other questions in Q&A section, and
sure. I'll just will go in the order how I see this question. So, anonymous attendee, did Soviet Union proceed specifically against other countries like Lithuania or Belarus in the same way as against Ukraine, causing, for example, famine as in the Ukrainian case? Again, the famine in particular was a story dealing with the southern areas of the Soviet Union, which were to a different degree grain producing areas. Again, Ukraine, as I explained, was treated as one big grain producing area when in fact it was not. So Belarus, Lithuania, collectivization in Belarus was of course happening at that time. Lithuania was not part of the Soviet Union, so it wasn't affected. But my understanding of Belarus is that the level of the starvation there was no famine, and level of starvation was there, but was much lower. I say that on the basis that the Ukrainian peasants were trying to flee Ukraine, go into Belarus and Russia, and they were stopped by the police cordons. So this is the famine is really the story of Ukraine, Kuban and Low Volga region, at least on that scale. Virginia Holt, often if there is ignorance of what has happened, as well as ignorance of what is happening, the general population cannot act to improve the situation. A good TV miniseries, which hit a larger older population, which might open doors to getting materials which often no one knows what to do with after opening one's parents' or grandparents' files. My great generation father was a World War II lead navigator whose squadron bombed the Nazi arms factories from 1943 in Polessi, maybe Romania, flying out of Foggia, Italy. Maybe Ploesti, I don't know in Romania. Now that my mother is gone, I am gathering his materials to likely give all to the World War II Museum. Yes, I certainly agree. There is no really substitute for TV series, good film. I know that from my research on famine. Again, the amount of attention that the topic got after Agnieszka's Holland film, Mr. Jones, is really unprecedented. I know also that from other area of my research, and that's history of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. The HBO miniseries did just miracles in terms of attracting people's attention to that subject. So I agree with you, and our task as academics is not just asking good and smart questions, not only being honest in doing our research, but also it's also our responsibility in spreading the word or letting the world know about what we are doing. This is also our responsibility, and we should treat it seriously. So I thank you for the question, and I'll take it as an encouragement to continue doing what we are doing, but maybe a little bit better and in a more innovative way. Okay, and that's at least the last question that I see in the Q&A, and the chat is, we don't have any questions in the chat, right?
Yeah. So there's also one more question of Eric Habowski. So about
it's in the Q&A. Somehow I missed it. Okay. Yeah, Eric Habowski. Yes. Genocide is not only a mass crime, but above all, it is crime of intent, a planned crime. A crime often resulting from cold politics, cold inhuman calculation. An inherent feature is the intention to destroy a nation, a group in whole or in part. In Stalinist Russia, genocide has become an idea of social engineering, one of the techniques of totalitarian rule. Will you agree? Yes, I will agree, and I can add to that a little bit, in a sense that even in what we know from the history of the famine, we have people like Lazar Kaganovich, one of the chief architects of the famine, almost on record, at least people write that he was saying that the policies were intended, they didn't mind actually starving to death people. Because as Kaganovich said, okay, that would learn, the peasants would learn the lesson. And another comment that I want to make in that regard is to direct people who might be interested in that to the work done by another historian, very good Italian historian, Andrea Graziosi, whose argument on the famine as a genocide is different from the one that Lemkin, for example, is proposing in terms of looking at that as part of a bigger policy and effort. Andrea Graziosi says roughly the following, and again, maybe details a little bit shaky, but you can go and look at his publications. But he's saying that the policies on collecting the grain, extracting the grain, became genocidal really in December of 1932, when it was already clear that the famine was happening. And then in December 32, in January of 1931, a conscious decision was made by Stalin and by the top leadership to go and take not just grain, but food from people who already died, who were starving. And at least for Andrea Graziosi, and I agree with them, that indicates the intent. You know what is happening, and you know what will happen if you take even whatever food is left there. So again, thanks for this question, and I certainly agree with your more general approach to that.
Many thanks. Many thanks. I would like to thank also all the audience. if you want to get our newsletter and with invitation for next seminars, or if we do something online, please, or if you are in Berlin on site, please fill this, leave this feedback by filling this questionnaire Patrick just sent. And I would like to thank Serhii for this really interesting talk about important project, important database. And I think these findings are really just interesting also in comparative perspective. I myself, I will go to this database on the website of Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute to check how it's built and how can we use it. And I encourage everybody to do the same. I encourage also to go to the cinema or to Netflix or something like that. So to look at this film by Agnieszka Holland, Mr. Jones. And yes, and I want to thank my colleagues for help in preparation of the seminar. And once again, many thanks to Serhii. Many thanks to all.
Thank you very much, Mateusz. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
For me, it was also a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night.